These people are so mean, man. Just vicious. I've never been vicious. I don't understand it. It's a text I got last night from a friend. We were reading Twitter and reading things about me, and he was amazed, as I am. And what we both have realized for a while is we are now a nation of haters. The presumption in our society and so many interactions, all too often, is a presumption of hate, to hate the other person. I want to talk to you a little bit about the implications of that as I see it for our politics and for our society, and offer up some tentative ideas of how I think we can address it and why we must address it. I think right now, if you look at the challenges we face as a country, I don't think there's anything more important for us to address. To go from being a nation of haters to a nation that has the presumption of grace. The presumption of grace is really what I want to talk about. The presumption of grace means you don't assume that the person who you're in combat with on social media or cable TV or in the Congress of the United States is a bad person. You will never change in our current society away from the presumption of guilt, because that's what people have in our society now. They assume the other person is guilty of being a bad person. But we need to find a way to go from being a society that has a presumption of hatred to a presumption of grace, meaning you afford the other person humanity. You afford them understanding. And it's not just in the easiest cases. It's easy in the easiest cases. It's easy to afford the presumption of grace to your best friend or your significant other when they do something you don't like, usually. It's hard. It's the hardest thing to afford the presumption of grace to someone you detest. Maybe you're a Joe Biden voter and you detest President Trump. That's the hard part. And that's what we need. A presumption of grace, a universal, constant presumption of grace. This is not a new problem. There has been hatred and a lack of grace throughout not just American history, but human history. Why is it different now? Well, because it's not just about Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump not liking each other. The lack of the presumption of grace is everywhere. It's in our social media and on our cable news. And it's been proliferated by organizations that call themselves news organizations, but I would say are simply purveyors of hate. And it's not just professionals. I'm stunned to this day when people who I used to spend pleasant times in green rooms with, back when I did that, will not afford me a presumption of grace publicly or privately. But I'm more stunned when strangers on social media, again, particularly Twitter, don't want to extend to me a presumption of grace, or to anyone. The conclusion that people leap to right away is that the person they're opposing, that they're facing off with, that they're shouting at in one form or another, doesn't deserve the presumption of grace. Now, I understand hate. To paraphrase the famous Jimmy Carter line, I have felt hate in my heart. I still do, more than I should. After 3 years, when almost all of my public life and much of my private life had been defined to some extent by the lack of presumption of grace, I get it on some level, but I really don't get it. I don't get why it is that people now, almost always, when they're in the public square, have a presumption of hate, not a presumption of grace. Is it what they feel in their heart organically? I find that so hard to believe about most of them. And I know many of the people who show me no grace, and I'm using myself as an example because it's the example I know best. I know they don't hate me. And yet in public, they feel compelled to not show me grace. Is it a tactic? I think for some people it is. It's a tactic to intimidate. It's a tactic to show how tough they are. It's a tactic to feel good about maybe adding some followers on social media. I think a lot of the time what it's a product of is it's a product of wanting to not be beat and feeling that the other side is not going to show a presumption of grace. So they better not do it and look weak. Neera Tanden, I think, feels grace towards other people, but frequently on her Twitter account, she did not afford people the presumption of grace. The president has distorted and warped and accelerated so many things in our society.
This election was a fraud.
he doesn't show the presumption of grace very often, to say the least. And I think that's caused a lot of people on the left who, in their heart, feel a presumption of grace towards many, to when they're on the national public town square, show it towards none. Now, what does this have to do with politics and meeting our challenges? Well, for a long time, one of the things I've studied about American politics is the incentives. All of the polarization and all the partisanship, all the negativity, it came from the incentives for politicians and fundraisers and cable TV news hosts and people on social media. The incentive was to be negative and loud, because the louder you were and the more negative you were, the more rewards you got, the less likely you were to lose your next election, the more likely you were to get a book deal. The presumption of grace can't be extended because you look weak. The incentive now is not as so much to be negative as it is to hate. The incentive, the rewards come for those who hate. So if you're a White House correspondent for CNN and you don't afford anyone associated with the Trump administration a presumption of grace, you're rewarded. You get more famous. You get more attention. Maybe you get a raise and a promotion. You saw, if you were watching the graphics put up a little earlier, 2 headlines about me, one from a left-wing publication, one from a right-wing publication. I call them the dailies, the Daily Beast and the Daily Caller. They write a lot of negative stories about me. And again, I'm talking about myself because it's the case I know best. They succeed because at the very center of the ethos of what defines them as organizations, not news organizations, as organizations, is the determined, ostentatious flaunting of an absence of the willingness to afford anyone the presumption of grace. Bill Clinton has a saying that I think applies here. He says, it's better to be strong and wrong in politics often than right and weak. And I think the reason that we see so little of the presumption of grace is because it's now been drilled into people, and not just professionals, but rank and file, grassroots folks around the country, my readers of Wide World of News, that to show someone the presumption of grace is to show weakness. And it is better to be strong and wrong than weak and right. The right thing to do is to try to show everyone, except in the most extreme circumstances, the presumption of grace. We will not address the pandemic or the education gap or the policing crisis or the slow economy or anything else we face, I believe, because right now, the absence of the presumption of grace causes everyone to be always at their battle stations, always looking to scorn, criticize, hate, rather than look for solutions, look to work together. Again, I don't want to overstate the case. America has always had conflict. We had a civil war not that long ago. But what's different now is the pervasiveness. It is 24/7. And you look around in periods before, there were prominent voices on the national town square who implicitly and explicitly granted a presumption of grace. Look really hard for them now. You won't find very many, even amongst those in our society who you think would be the most inclined to do it. When Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, says she prays to the president regularly, with all due respect to her, do you think she's extending the presumption of grace when she says that? I single her out because I think she could. I think she could be a leader here. But she, like everyone else in a position of leadership throughout our society, not just in politics, are faced with the implications of what happens if they afford someone their tribe doesn't like a presumption of grace. So I'll tell you the 3 things I've been thinking about to try to deal with this, because I think it's so important that we do, not just to solve our problems in Congress and in state capitals, not just to have a better educated and better informed electorate, but because it's the right thing to do for our society, for our children and grandchildren, to have a society where the presumption is of grace and not of hate. First thing I want to do is figure out how to form a gang of good, a gang of grace. I don't want Twitter to be dominated by hate. I want Twitter to have people who, when they see someone who's not extending grace to someone else, they reach out and they say, that's not the right thing to do. They support the person. Maybe they show grace to that person. That can happen on the floor of Congress. That can happen on Twitter. That can happen on cable TV. That's going to require a lot of people, because there are a lot of people out there who are animated by the presumption of hate and the presumption of guilt. The second thing I think is important is that we approach this problem, those of you who wish to join me in trying to deal with this, like King and Gandhi. We can't hate the haters. We won't win. Justice won't win. Grace won't win. Confronting someone who's not showing the presumption of grace with grace is, I think, the only way to make this happen. Because I think in their hearts, they'd rather be people of grace. Finally, and I think practically most important, is the leadership. And I say leadership in air quotes. I think that most leaders, heads of universities, heads of companies, politicians, most would like to extend the presumption of grace to people who make mistakes, to people who say the wrong thing, to people who they're in combat with of one sort or another. I think they'd like to. And they'd like to run organizations where that is the rule. But they're so afraid of being seen as weak or out of step with those who dominate the discussion with their presumptions of hatred that they cower. And they pretend that when they make decisions in favor of those who hate versus those who show grace, that they're doing it based on some principle, when they're not. They're doing it because they're afraid. And so the most important thing, I think, from a practical point of view, form our good gang of grace, bring the right ethos to it. But the most important thing is to find a way to give the incentive to these so-called leaders to do not what is strong and wrong, but strong and right. And strong and right begins, and I think ends to some extent, with the presumption of grace.